All right, so we've talked about the ingredients of a good public opinion poll, but to be honest, they're not always followed, and like sound sort of like strategy in implementing these polls isn't always followed either. So there are three famous results of polls that have just gone terribly wrong, and often obviously frustrate and confuse a lot of people when this happens. So these are the three sort of like case studies in sort of like polling sometimes going wrong. So here's an example. 1936, a famous Literary Digest poll for the 1936 election. Literary Digest was one of the preeminent sort of like publications at the time. This was obviously President Roosevelt running for re-election again, running against the Republican challenger Alfred Landon. Um, the Literary Digest poll that was published actually predicted a massive win for the Republican challenger and a pretty sound defeat for Roosevelt seeking reelection. Um, if you look at the election map, it is the single greatest landslide in the history of presidential elections. The blue states are all of those states that voted for Roosevelt, and the red states are those that voted for Landon. It wasn't even close. You couldn't have been more wrong in sort of like your prediction if you were Literary Digest. They were forced to actually publish a cover, basically talking about how embarrassed they were and how bad the polls had been prior to the 36 election. Right? It's like, what's the fatal flaw of the poll? Right? After you do sort of the autopsy of like the poll and like what went wrong, how did we screw up so bad? One of the things that came out was that all of the participants were basically from the surveys from Literary Digest were basically taken from either the phone book or from lists of car owners. That's how Literary Digest essentially found its survey participants. But you may not think much of that, except for the fact that in 1936, if you owned a car, and even if you owned a phone, you were considered to be more affluent, definitely more wealthy. So probably also meant that you were more likely maybe to gravitate towards the Republican Party, right? Just based on like the demographics at the time. So now like you're over like including Republican participants in your survey. So like you're getting like these results back that are showing that the Republican candidate's going to win. It wasn't like a representative or even really random sample, right? And that's why this poll was so wrong. If you look at another one, Gallup, which is still around today, they're like one of the preeminent polling organizations still in existence today. They badly got the 1948 presidential election sort of polls wrong. So this was an election that the primary candidates were Harry Truman, who was a Democrat, and Thomas Dewey, who was a Republican. And if you look, sort of like the final polling numbers had the Republican, Dewey, at almost 50% and Truman at 44%. So essentially predicting a relatively comfortable victory for Dewey going into the election. But if you see, the electoral votes ended up being a landslide, and the popular votes were almost completely like reversed from what Gallup had predicted. In fact, people had used this polling data to just think that Dewey's election was going to be like a foregone conclusion. And this is the famous picture that kind of stems from this is that the Chicago Daily Tribune was so confident in Gallup's polling numbers, they actually had newspapers printed saying that Dewey was going to beat Truman like ahead of time. And this is the famous shot of Truman after the election results are announced, sort of like holding up the newspaper, sort of like mocking the predicted like election results. So again, like what's the fatal flaw of this survey? Well, the Gallup organization actually stopped polling 2 weeks prior to election day, which is ridiculous, right? To be honest, that's probably when people are most deciding. Again, this sort of would leave out all of the people that were undecided leading up to election day, or even taking out of consideration that people might change their minds. And obviously, the results that you got were not accurate. And then the last one is considerably more recent. I would say almost every single poll in 2016 got the election sort of prediction wrong. Almost every single major poll had Hillary Clinton winning going into election day. And obviously, that's not how it transpired. And we've talked about this a couple times already during the course of the year. And there are a couple of fatal flaws when we look back on the 2016 polls. This realization now that sometimes the polls have a really hard time capturing accurate Trump support, because one of the arguments that Trump has made from the beginning of his political career is that the media is biased towards him. Fake news became like sort of a tagline. Almost all of the major polls are conducted by major media organizations. So there's some idea that perhaps many of the Trump supporters just don't participate in these polls because they think that they're biased and they're part of biased media organizations against the candidate. So that perhaps you're not representing really Trump supporters enough in these surveys or these polls. And fatal flaw number two is that some research has shown, and again, I've referred to them as like shy Trumpers, that they are pretty passionate Trump supporters, that they don't truthfully participate in the surveys because they anticipate that there's going to be like negative judgment from the person that's conducting the survey if they say they're voting for Trump. Again, goes along with like maybe this distrust of the media, thinking that the media is like favoring one particular candidate, and there's going to be judgment if they say that they support like Trump, like the other candidate. So that oftentimes in survey results, you may have some of these sort of like Trump supporters in this category, when asked, saying that they're not sure who they're going to vote for, even though they know who they're going to vote for. Or on the other hand, they in some cases they even say they're voting for another candidate just because they don't really care about the poll, they don't really care about the organization conducting the poll, and like they don't want like backlash or judgment from that person, so they'll just give them the answer that they think they want, and then they vote like a different way. So these are the three elections in which you saw really on a presidential level the polls just fail miserably.